Howdy folks, welcome to the channel, The Agnostic Philosopher. That's me, Don. I used to run in fundamentalist Christian circles about 25 or so years ago, and I did enormous research, and then it was basically the research that caused me to question some of my own assumptions I'd made about the Bible and other things. But dogma, I'm not dogmatic. I like arguments, and I don't mean yelling, screaming type arguments. I mean, I like looking at the way arguments are made and what assumptions are being employed within the arguments and so on, and just sort of analyzing them to see if they can add anything to my life or if they would detract from it if I went with it. But right now we're looking at, it's a philosophy of religion topic. I think that's what I put in the search bar for YouTube when looking for new material to present to you guys and to look at, and Anselm and the Argument for God popped up. I said, let's find out who Anselm is, and he was one who put out an argument, an ontological argument, one that was in favor of the existence of God. Now, to me, it does make logical sense that there was a creator of all the matter that we see in the universe, because as human beings, we are wired for pattern recognition. And pattern recognition generally begins with a premise somewhere on which the rest is built. To me, the matter in the universe, all that we see, came from somewhere. It makes sense to me. It may not have been, though, because our conception of time and space and all that is fairly limited. No matter how advanced you may be in your study of it, it's still very limited. So it could be that the matter in the universe simply always was. And the infinite regress argument, for the counterpoint to my statement that the matter in the universe must have come from somewhere because everything has a beginning, then the follow-up is, then where did God come from? And if I posit that, well, God just always was, then you are equally entitled, and it's equally valid to say, well, the matter in the universe always was, without adverting to some belief in a divine being. So my belief is not based on biblical text or writings or anything. It's just based on that one simple, if you stop somewhere on that infinite regress and you've got two choices, unless you have a third one, either God created all this, or the matter simply always was, mankind is the product of evolution, and we made up this divine being because we can't handle the idea of death, some variation of that. And fair enough, it's all fair game. None of it phases me in the least. But we're going to look at what his argument for God is. And this was conceived evidently a priori, which is to say the product of reasoning and therefore deductive, versus the product of experience, which is a posteriori. And so you infuse thought with experience and you say, okay, here's how we account for that. And that's after an event happens, so to speak. Then you analyze it and you give your reasonings for it. Here we go.
It's about time we had a serious talk about religion. The philosophy of religion is often confused with theology, which makes sense because they both take God and religion as their subjects. But theology starts with assuming that God exists and then figures out what follows, where theology might try to solve philosophical problems that might arise from a belief in God. But one thing that's never on the table in theology is simply not believing in God. Atheism is not an option. That's what separates the philosophical study of religion from the theological. Philosophers take nothing as a given, and that includes religious belief. Everything is on the table, and everything needs an argument. So no area of belief is sacred, and that means even your sacred beliefs are going to need to be examined, and evidence will need to be given. Some people say that religion is the one area where you don't need arguments, that faith alone is enough. But philosophers don't take faith for an answer. After all, I might have faith that the moon is made of green cheese. So what? Faith is definitionally unprovable, which makes it, from a philosophical perspective, not valuable. So if you're a theist, now's the time to offer some justifications for your beliefs. And if you're an atheist, it's time for you to pay attention too. No one's off the hook. We all need to pay attention to these arguments because religion is hugely important. Can you think of many things that have been as influential in shaping human history than religious belief? Probably not. Right. So if we can get to the bottom of it, we should.
And just as an aside, I was listening to a seminar, and I've listened to it a few times, the lecturer said that somewhere between 85 and 90% of mankind believes in a higher power. It's not necessarily Jesus or Moses, the Hebraic and Abrahamic faiths or the Buddhist or what have you, and pantheistic religions. But if that many people believe in a higher power, what is the impact on the human brain? That was the study that was done. It was a neuroscientist just conducting studies to see what regions of the brain might be responsible or impacted by an active prayer life or belief in God. And it was a fascinating way for him to construct a study. But that's partly why this is all relevant too. Even if you're an atheist, it's good to know. Maybe you'll consider it as far as what you're up against, or it's like, okay, maybe I'll listen to this. I just want to see, just for my own edification, to see what the lines of thinking are out there.
I'll get to God in a minute, but first I want to go over a few things that the philosophy of religion is not. It's not about believing whatever your parents taught you, because that doesn't prove anything about the truth of a religious belief. If how you were raised proved something about religious truth, then every religion, and therefore also no religion, would be true. So how you were raised can give you a reason that you hold a certain belief, but it says nothing whatsoever about its truth. Philosophy of religion is also not the study of the Bible, because you can't use what's written in a book to prove the truth of the book. You need outside evidence. There's also a whole area of scholarship devoted to understanding the Bible by considering the time and place in which it was written, and such study can be very helpful in understanding certain things about religion. But it doesn't help us here. Philosophy of religion is also not religious anthropology, or religious sociology, or psychological understanding of our reasons for religious belief. Those are all wonderful things that you can and should study, but they are not what we're studying here. What we are doing is considering whether we can offer arguments in support of belief in God's existence. And a long time ago there was a man who argued that God's existence is provable, 11th century French monk Anselm of Canterbury. He offered a deductive argument for the existence of God based on what he understood to be the nature of God's being, or the definition of God. Because the study of being is called ontology, his argument and others like it are called ontological arguments. Now, what do you think God is like? Long, flowing white beard, robe to match, nice guy, hard to reach on the phone. Well, Anselm aimed a little bit higher. In fact, he thought God is, by definition, the best possible thing we can imagine. The best thing. Just try to think of the coolest, awesomest, most amazing and wonderful thing you can imagine, and whatever you're thinking of, Anselm said that God is better. He's just the best. In Anselm's words, God is that than which no greater can be conceived. So what does that mean? Well, it means that God must exist, according to Anselm. After all, he pointed out there are just two ways in which something can exist. Something can exist only in our minds and be strictly imaginary, like Santa or unicorns, or it can exist in our minds but also in reality, like pizza and horses, something that we can imagine, but that's also real. Anselm pointed out, and he does appear to be right about this, that any good thing would be better if it existed in reality as well as in our minds. I mean, unicorns, they're pretty great. But wouldn't they be better if they were real? Or the perfect romantic partner. Smart, funny, hot, likes the same movies and games that you do, pretty rich, would be pretty nice in your mind, but even better if they actually existed. Well, Anselm thought so too. And from there, he believed he could prove God's existence. Because if we define God as the greatest thing that we can conjure up in our minds, the only thing that could possibly be greater than him would be a real version. And since we're already imagining the greatest thing possible, there can't be anything better, therefore God has to exist both in imagination and in reality.
It's kind of a wish list, though, in a sense. I'm going to see where he's going to go with this, but just because something is better if it existed in reality, which I don't think that's always the case. I think that there is a case for a creative brain, for imaginations and such, and then reality as you grow up, from a kid playing with toys and army men and doll, whatever, and then as you grow up and your experience shapes that, it's still fun. I mean, we watch television. Is television real? I mean, physically, yes. The characters, though, we call them fictional. I mean, they're on the screen, on this flat screen, shooting out to us and projecting images and ideas and thoughts. But are they? Is it better that they exist? may be irrelevant to the discussion in a certain way, because the difference between fiction and nonfiction is one thing actually happened and the other didn't, but it still stimulates the brain. But in this context, just by saying it's better that this being existed that I can imagine, you're still playing mind games. So let's see how this argument's further developed.
Anselm was sure that he had done it, deductively proven God's existence in a way that was immune to error. Here it is one more time, laid out as a philosophical argument. God is the greatest thing we can think of. Things can exist only in our imaginations, or they can also exist in reality. Things that exist in reality are always better than things that exist only in our imaginations. If God existed only in our imaginations, he wouldn't be the greatest thing that we can think of, because God in reality would be better, therefore, God must exist in reality. Anselm thought this was a tidy little argument, but one of his contemporaries, a fellow French monk named Guanelot, wasn't satisfied. He suggested that we could run the same line of reasoning to prove the existence of literally anything we can imagine. He came up with an argument with the exact same formal structure as Anselm's to prove that a mythical lost island exists. He proposed, the best island I can imagine is one where I can swim and relax on a tropical beach and ski down snow-covered mountains all in one afternoon. I can imagine it, so it must exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the best island. There would be one better, and that one would have to be real. Basically, Guanelot said, you could make the same kind of argument to prove the existence of whatever you most wanted, but it wouldn't make it real. Anselm responded to Guanelot's criticism by saying that he'd missed the point, that the argument only works for necessary beings, of which there is only one. God. Folks, what we have right here is a classic example of the fallacy known as begging the question.
Yep,
a fallacy is a flaw in reasoning, something that weakens or destroys an argument, and when you beg the question, you assume the very thing you're trying to prove with your argument. By adding this idea of a necessary being to his definition of God, Anselm makes God's existence a part of the definition of God. A necessary being is one that must exist, so Anselm's response assumed the very point of contention to be true, that God exists. Other philosophers since Anselm have tried to save his argument by tweaking it in various ways, and dissenters have continued trying to deflate them. One of the most famous objections came hundreds of years after Anselm's time, from the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant offered the point that, as he put it, existence is not a predicate. A predicate is just something that's said of another object, and Kant thought Anselm's mistake was in thinking that existence is something that can be predicated upon a thing, or used as a defining characteristic. For example, if a triangle exists, it necessarily has three sides, but it could be that no triangle exists at all because the idea of existence isn't part of how we define a triangle. Likewise, Kant would say, if God exists, then he must be the greatest being that we can imagine, but that does not mean that he does exist. Predicates add to the essence of their subjects, Kant explained, but they can't be used to prove their existence.
It also makes our conception of things godlike. We're saying that this is the greatest thing ever, so we are, in one sense, already predicating that we understand everything. And that is obviously a problem, because how do we know? We're very prejudiced in that way if we think that this is the greatest thing ever. There may be some other greatest thing, not greatest being, but greatest thing perhaps for our own existence, for our own happiness. There's so many different ways the argument can be taken. But the assumption that I can posit what the greatest thing is, and that, according to Anselm here now, that greatest thing is God, is saying that I already know what the greatest things are. So anyhow, let's continue this.
British philosopher John Wisdom came up with a thought exercise that sounds a lot like a debate over an ontological argument. It's called The Parable of the Invisible Gardener, which brings us to this week's Flash Philosophy. Let's go to the thought bubble. Person A and Person B return to a garden after a long absence and notice that a few of its plants are still thriving. Person A says a gardener must have been tending the garden while they were gone. Person B doubts this is true, so they agree to wait and see if a gardener shows up. After some time passes, they see no one, so Person A says the gardener must be invisible, so they put up traps and bring in bloodhounds to catch him. When no one is found, Person A says the gardener must be intangible as well as unsmellable, to which B replies,
This is what you can expect in philosophy too, that you can go in any direction, but the bottom line is, if it makes sense, it makes sense. But this is where, even in businesses, those of you who are considering being a philosophy major, businesses today, and the recording of this is in 2025, many of them want philosophy majors like former philosopher or philosophers in some capacity because they think outside the box. They're able to see things from many different angles because they're not so wedded to what are known as sunk costs and so forth. Because when money's on the line, you actually want to maximize your return on investment and so forth. But philosophers, when you're sort of trained or you've made it through in any college and gotten a degree in philosophy and maybe some other academic pursuit as well. I was a double major at Rutgers, philosophy and criminal justice as part of pre-law, because conceptualizing different ways of viewing, defending a client or prosecuting somebody, or in business, where should we best allocate our funds? Should we increase or decrease advertising spending? Where should we bring in the marketing people? Search engine optimization for whatever your online endeavors are, all this sort of stuff. Like, how should we think about this? What is the name for the business? What do we stand for as a brand? What is going to resonate with the public? All these things, you need to be able to conceptualize many different sides of arguments. This one here, even though it's kind of funny to see on occasion to stand back and see how an argument would be made, it is very useful to have that creative mind engaged.
What's the difference between an invisible, intangible, unsmellable, entirely undetectable gardener and no gardener at all? Thanks, Thought Bubble. Can you guess who A and B are really talking about? To give you a sense of how long this back and forth has been going on among philosophers trying to either prove or disprove the existence of God, John Wisdom came up with this parable in 1944, nearly 1,000 years after Anselm and Guanilo. Today, we introduced a new area of philosophy, a philosophy of religion, and we learned about Anselm's argument for God's existence, while also considering objections to that argument. An important point to note here is that both Guanilo and Kant agreed with Anselm's conclusion. They also believed in God's existence. They just thought Anselm's argument didn't prove it. So remember, you can think an argument fails even if you accept the conclusion. When this happens, you should look for a better argument in favor of your conclusion. This is exactly what Thomas Aquinas did, and we'll consider him next time.
Ooh, I may have to look at that one and see what Aquinas had to say. I don't know a lot of Aquinas' work. This was enlightening because it tied in the philosophical approach to things. This was very, very good. I enjoyed this a lot. And yes, you can have a sound argument in which the premises are true and the conclusion is true. This is generally deductive reasoning, what we call deductive reasoning versus inductive reasoning, which inductive reasoning is frequently based on experience, but it's more prone to error. That's how we conceptualize it. Versus a valid argument. A valid argument is one where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, but the premises themselves are either false or suspect. So it's a weaker argument or just a false argument. So an argument can be valid but false, and that's what he's saying Anselm's argument here. Or some people said Anselm's argument was just that. But it doesn't mean the conclusion is wrong. For example, if it's not raining, today is Tuesday. It is not raining. Therefore, today is Tuesday. That is a valid argument, but it's unsound, okay? Because the premises, even though the conclusion follows from the premises themselves are prone to error without going into all the problems with those. But the argument for God is going to go on. And this is one of the things where it's really just a feel. That you can't disprove the existence or lack thereof of God. You can't disprove that. At least my opinion. I'm the one giving it, so clearly it's my opinion. But even on deductive grounds or inductive grounds, no matter how you look at it, you can't disprove it. It really is in some way, it's a feel that you have. And hardcore atheists just don't feel any pull in the direction of being a supreme being. They're deductionists, or reductionists rather, reducing everything to physical properties. But then when you look at physical properties, you find out that we really don't understand physics very well. We don't understand. Like this table here, as hard as it seems, is comprised basically of empty space. So what is a physical object? How do they interrelate? Why are galaxies traveling faster away from us than the speed of light, which is theoretically supposed to be impossible for anything with mass to travel faster than the speed of light. Even light can't travel faster than the speed of light. These are fascinating, wonderful things to study, look at. You can have fun with it. And people who are hardcore believers in Jesus Christ and God raised him from the dead, or Torah, or whatever people say, or the Quran, or people's hardcore beliefs are, just say, you're ridiculous. There is a God, and they get angry. And then you've got your atheists who say, this is absurd, there is no God, and they get angry. And it's like, the beauty of being a philosopher is you don't have to get angry. You can just say, wow, that's a really weak argument, and you can explain why. So to yourself, you have reasons for it. But the idea of having something that says, you know what, like what I said in the beginning, I personally think that it makes more sense to me that all the matter that we see in the universe came from an independent being, an agent, somebody, something created all the matter that we see in the universe based on my understanding of pattern recognition, and that we have a starting point. It just makes more sense to me that some kind of being set things in motion. And life on planet Earth is a disaster. It's difficult. There's death, disease, lying, all these things that we conceptualize to be bad. So where did this being go? Off somewhere. We can't see, our five senses, we can't see, hear, taste, touch this being. And so you just look at that and you're like, that puts us at a disadvantage immediately, because the way we accumulate information, aside from the a priori arguments, is via the five senses. And we can't sense that God. We can only think and say what makes the most sense from the outside into us, but it makes it very difficult. So that was wonderful. And maybe I'll get to Aquinas at some point. All right, folks, leave your comments. I read them. Have a great day. I'll see you on another video, and keep thinking philosophically.